Let's continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, A Life by Michael Ignatieff. This is chapter 18, Retrospect. This is the second part. The work of preparing this material for publication required prodigious tenacity and inventiveness. For example, using an ultraviolet filter to render visible a page of a typescript, bleached into ineligibility by the sun, when piercing together the 40,000-word essay on Haman, written in the early 1960s and then discarded unfinished. Hardy realized that a crucial section of one of its main chapters was missing. In the basement at Huntington, he found the dictables on which the original dictation had been made, but no machine to play them on. With the help of the National Sound Archive at the National Science Museum, a surviving example of the machine was found. The dictables were played, and over the crackle and hiss, Berlin could clearly be heard dictating the missing pages, some 4,000 words in all. Hardy transcribed the missing material, and after further editorial reconstruction, the completed manuscript was finally published in 1993 as the Magus of the North. Berlin himself regarded Hardy's work of resurrection with bemused detachment and occasional irritation, followed by growing gratitude and pride. He told everyone that Hardy had transformed his reputation. Most of the lectures and essays dated from the golden period between about 1952 and 1966. Now, Isaiah could see that he had been extraordinarily productive. The question arises as to why Berlin should have been so careless about what he had written, why he should have completed monographs on D. Mastery and Haman, and then abandoned them as unfinished torsos. Why he should have completed no fewer than 7 lecture series and failed to publish any of them. Whether he intended to abandon them or actually had one eye on posterity, without Hardy's prodigious feats of resurrection, they would never have seen the light of day. Now was Hardy the only one to set about re-evaluating and re-estimating Berlin's reputation. Pupils, friends, and admirers produced 2 Festschriften, one for his 70th birthday, initiated by Henry Hardy and edited by Alan Royne, helping to establish his centrality as a philosopher of freedom. The second for his 80th, edited by Avishai and Edna Maglet, exploring his work in the philosophy of moral pluralism. Besides these marks of recognition from his closest friends, Isaiah received honorary doctorates from Harvard, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge, Athens, Bologna, Toronto, and many other universities. By the late 1970s, he was England's most celebrated public intellectual, even though he rarely took public positions and shied away from publicity. He and Allen became guests at Buckingham Palace and Downing Street. When an Israeli dignitary or a person of intellect was being honored at Downing Street during Mrs. Thatcher's premiership, He was presented to Mikhail Gorbachev, who, on shaking his hand, said with a characteristic mixture of twinkle and menace, "We know all about you." Berlin was less entranced with Gorbachev than many of his liberal friends, believing that any attempt to revivify Leninist idealism and save the communist system was doomed to failure. He lived to be proved right. To the annoyance of his left-wing friends, Berlin accepted invitations to Downing Street, and he rather enjoyed Mrs. Thatcher's company. Whenever they met, she would ask him what he was working on, and when he replied not very much, she would shake her finger at him in mock reproach. "You must work, Isaiah. You must work." "Yes, madam," he would dutifully reply. In 1979, he was awarded Israel's most prestigious literary honor, the Jerusalem Prize. In 1983, he was one of the recipients of the Erasmus Prize, and in 1988, he was honored with the Agnelli Prize for contribution to the ethical understanding of advanced societies. He professed to be mystified by this last honor, since he claimed he had never written anything on the subject. He appreciated the recognition, worried that he was being overpraised, and richly enjoyed the comedy of laudatory occasions. The Agnetti Prize, for example, was awarded in Turin Opera House in front of over 1,000 people, including the former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, the American banker and financier Felix Rohatyn, and his old friend, the publisher Lord Weidenfeld. Berlin was seated beside the Fiat automobile magnate Giovanni Agnelli, who fidgeted throughout the musical interludes, Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, and Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. Seeing that his benefactor was tiring of all the high culture and fine speeches, Berlin advised Agnelli to while away the tedium by thinking of something agreeable. Agnelli brightened up and whispered that he would turn over in his mind. Slowly and voluptuously, are the most beautiful women he had ever known. This, he confided, sotto voce, would take at least 3/4 or even a whole hour. He assumed a beatific expression, ignored the music and speeches, and fell into a delicious reverie. Berlin enjoyed the fun and frivolity of these occasions, but they were also moments to take stock. This was not easy, for he had never had a very strong sense of his own intellectual agenda. Indeed, it was only when others began to take up his ideas in the late 1970s and 1980s that he began to understand the extent of their hidden coherence. Now he could look back and see the paths he had been following. For the Agnetti Prize, he attempted to express the one big thing that the hedgehog had known all along. The essay he composed, The Pursuit of the Ideal, was too long, not merely for Signor Agnetti, but for the rest of the audience in the Turin Opera House. So a sharply abbreviated form was read, not by Berlin himself, since both his voice and his Italian were too weak for the occasion, but by his Italian publisher. The pursuit of the ideal made plain that all the disparate studies of Machiavelli, Vico, Herder, Herzen, and Tolstoy were not separate exercises, but a sustained philosophical inquiry into the history of human values. These studies had taught him, he said, that value systems, Christian mercy as compared with a Roman virtue, for example, were sufficient unto themselves and incommensurable with those of other epochs. Progress was possible in science and technology, but there was no such libretto in ethics. The virtues and values of late modernity were neither better nor worse than those of the medieval age. They were incommensurable with them. This position led easily to relativism, to the proposition that human conduct could only be judged by internal, variable, or contextual standards. Berlin's friend and colleague Arnold Momigliano had suggested as much in a review of Vico and Herder in 1976. If so, Berlin's liberal tolerance rested on nothing more than a quasi-live and light lie. Berlin insisted that Momigliano had confused relativism and pluralism. No matter how different value systems might be, to be called human, they had to refer to recognizably human needs and purposes. Forms of life differ. Ends, moral principles are many, but not infinitely many. They must be within the human horizon. In the light of this common horizon, certain ultimate and non-relativist standards of evaluation were recognized as common by all human cultures. But if all cultures recognized certain crimes, they did not all recognize the same virtues. It was a rationalist form of arrogance or to suppose that these differences could be put down to superstition or ignorance. Variety, including moral variety, was built into the constitution of humankind. Such differences, if within the human horizon, were entitled to respect and should be guaranteed by a regime of liberty. Moreover, systems of values were never internally consistent. The conflict of values, liberty versus equality, justice versus mercy, tolerance versus order, liberty versus social justice, resistance versus prudence, was intrinsic to human life. Liberty ought to have a certain priority without some modicum of it. He said, quote, "There is no choice and therefore no possibility of remaining human as we understand the word," end quote. But even liberty might have to be curtailed in the interest of social justice. In the pursuit of the ideal, this last political of man mounted a defense of the necessity of politics. This least conflictual of man insisted on the inescapability of a moral conflict, and this least tragic of a man taught the necessity of a tragic choice. Quote, "Some of the great goods cannot live together." This is a conceptual truth. We are doomed to truth. and every choice must entail irreparable loss. End quote. The crimes of the century, and he now viewed his own century as the worst in recorded history, were the result of a faith in final solutions, and hence the failure to be reconciled to the limits of human reason and to the inevitability of a loss and error. These were indeed the core beliefs in moral pluralism, liberal freedom, and their mutual entailment. A huge literature was ensued on Berlin's pluralism for reasons that left him bemused, but which in retrospect seem clear enough. In a post-imperial world, cultural world views, religious, secular, Western, Eastern, Christian, Islamic, compete for allegiance in conditions of increasing equality. Working out how these ethical world views can inhabit the same political space has given especial salience to the problems of modern pluralism. Then there has been the fragmentation within Western values themselves, the re-emergence of a moral disagreement within liberal politics as previously suppressed or non-enfranchised groups. Women, children, homosexuals secured a political voice. All helped to make Berlin's question how to mediate between opposing moral worlds the central issue of late modern politics. Berlin himself had never given much thought to these features of late Western society. Indeed, the burden of his argument was that moral conflict was a feature of the human situation toward court, not just of modern times. He had never sought to make his work relevant, but now it suddenly spoke to his times in ways he never intended. He never claimed to have been the first to think about pluralism, but Berlin had a reason to believe that he was the first to argue that pluralism entailed liberalism. That is, if human beings disagreed about ultimate ends, the political system that best enabled them to adjudicate these conflicts was one which privileged their liberty, for only conditions of liberty could enable them to make the compromises between values necessary to maintain a free social life. Beyond the obvious circularity of this argument, the real difficulty, as John Gray has argued, is that a pluralist logically cannot put liberty first. Liberty is simply one of the values that must be reconciled with others. It is not the trump card. If so, why should a free society be valued above all? Berlin's later work opened up these questions, even though it failed to supply adequate answers. At the same time, the very incompleteness of his writing increased its power of suggestion, and he lived to see his work debated to the end of his days. Correspondents wrote in to ask him to clarify his thought so often that his secretary, Pat Utichin, used to groan at the very mention of pluralism, since it was bound to mean a painful morning. Taking down dictation of an immensely long, obscure, and difficult attempt on Berlin's part to explain himself once again. He could have denied it, but he was now looking back seeking to discern the hidden threads that hold his life together. In a warmly nostalgic letter to Mary Fisher Burnett, he had been his devoted friend since her father had been warden of a new college. Berlin said he was distressed to discover that his life was divided into compartments, quote, connected with couplings which one can walk on, but with effort. These continuities, Russia, prep school, St. Paul's, Oxford before the war, Washington, Oxford plus London, too much of the latter. After the war, marriage and Haddington, all not exactly sealed off, but divided by gaps and held together by links, not organic and not quite my own. I hate change. Bricks walls and seemed to doomed to them. End quote. He exaggerated these continuities because he was embarrassed that he had seen so little for Mary since the war and wanted to stress that the neglect was symptomatic. But to the incredible degree, he kept his oldest friendships going. Maurice Bauer, David Cecil, Sheila Sokolova-Grant, Stephen Spender, Nicholas Nabokov, Noah Annan, and above all, Stuart Hampshire. And he had kept up his defining affiliations, membership of All Souls, and life in Huntington, Albany, and Prague. The continuities, not the discontinuities, are striking, and they must have contributed to that fixed sense of knowing who he was, of being well in his skin, which everyone noticed as he entered the autumn and winter of his life. He was fortunate, too, that his oldest friends were alive to keep him company. The oldest and most intimate of these were Stephen Spender and Stuart Hampshire, distinguished, witty, handsome, white-haired Englishmen, with all the worldliness and the conviction of all the 1930s undiminished in both of them. At the end of his life, Spender sent his old friend a poem by a 9th century Chinese writer, which was an elegy for their lifelong friendship. Quote, "We are growing old together, you and I. Let us ask ourselves what is age like. The idle head still uncombed at noon, propped on a staff, sometimes a walk abroad, or all day sitting with closed doors. One dares not look in the mirror's polished face. One cannot read small letter books. Deeper and deeper, one's love of old friends, fewer and fewer, one's dealings with a young man. One thing only, the pleasure of idle talk is great as ever when you and I meet." Spender died in 1993, and Berlin wrote to Natasha Spender, sadly recalling how much they had loved going to listen to Arthur Schnabel together, how Stuart Hampshire had said in admiration once while they were talking about Stephen, that there is nothing between him and the object, and how it seemed impossible to realize that he would never see him again. In his 80s, this fabric of continuity provided by old male friends slowly began to unravel. Barbara Cecil Spender were now gone. Others like Sheila Sokolova Grant, Mary Fisher, and Jean Flood he saw less frequently. He went to funerals, composed memorials to his friends, wrote affectionate letters to their families, which always emphasized that words were sticks insufficient to their purpose, and scanned the obituary pages for the demise of his contemporaries. These rituals of departure could only have made him aware of the imminence of his own. Once, while coming out of Lord Goodman's memorial service, at which Lord Annan had given the tribute, Berlin took Annan aside and whispered with a wink, "I want to book you for mine." His sense of humor flowed from his vitality, and it helped to keep night thoughts at bay. He joked about his own longevity, recalling the words of a Silicon brigand on his deathbed who was asked by a priest to pardon his enemies. "Father, I have none, for I have killed them all." But he missed some friends keenly and became aware, in fact, that aging had rendered him more, not less, susceptible to the misfortunes of others, as he told Merton White. Quote, "The proposition that the longer one lives, the more indifferent one becomes to the ills that beset one or one's dearest is totally false. I suffer much more from this than I used to, and I now realize that there must have been a long period of my life when I was, comparatively speaking, too little sensitive to the misfortunes of others, however close, certainly of my friends." Although he lost his old friends, he managed, even in his 70s and 80s, to make new and much younger ones. The more important of these friendships was with the Brendel family, with Alfred, the pianist, and his wife Rennie and their 3 children. They were drawn together by a common passion for Schubert, Beethoven, and Mozart, but they were soon discussing and arguing about every subject. Brendel had grown up in fascist Croatia during the war, and he found Berlin's willingness to speak positively about nationalism a mystifying bias, which he could only attribute to Berlin's Zionism. As an expatriate pianist making his living on the concert stages of the world, he had no similar longing to belong. But they agreed much more than they disagreed. For example, sharing exactly the same trial of fixed dislikes, noise, cigarette smoke, and the phonetics. Both had a strong sense of the absurd and could be seen at the Brendel house in Hampstead, laughing together at some private joke. Brendel's eyes alight with demonic glee, Isaiah shaking his shoulders and laughing soundlessly. Brendel was a deeply thoughtful and literate man whose work as a performer was free of grandiosity, showmanship, or false sentiment. His playing displayed a sureness of emotional pitch and a philosophical understanding of the meaning of nobility and pathos in music. Berlin also admired his ferocious dedication. Next to the photographs of Liszt in his practice room, there was a sign in German which read, "Art is nice, but it is a lot of hard work." Brendel, for his part, drew on Berlin's extraordinary memory for performance and repertoire stretching back to the 1930s. And despite the fact that Isaiah did not read music, they developed an intimate kind of shorthand for their musical conversations. With Berlin sometimes humming melodies or tapping them out on his knee, and Brando identifying them and then running through the various ways these themes might be played. Rennie Brando became one of the major confidants of Isaiah's old age, telephoning him almost daily, visiting him as often as a busy life made possible. She was to become the last in a line of vivacious and able women who were drawn to his vitality and whose joie de vivre revived his own. While he would have denied it, Isaiah was also making a few well-chosen farewells. In late March 1988, Isaiah went back to St. Petersburg and Moscow, where Brando gave 2 recitals. He walked for the last time through the rainy streets of St. Petersburg, past the Fountain House and Akhmatova's apartment. He made a dry-eyed and unsentimental farewell to the city of his childhood and to the Randua, which more than any other had changed his life. That's the end of chapter 18.